Hi, my name is Chris. I have an MA in anthropology, a deep interest in history, and a lot of rage. And we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the reasons for that rage today, so strap in. First off, I'm Filipino, so I was born into the post-colonial fallout of the Philippines' history, and this is why I'm using the Philippine example to talk about colonial land grab patterns. Also, the Philippines has experienced both extractive colonialism and settler colonialism, although the second kind was imposed by the Americans on the frontiers of Palawan and Mindanao through Filipinos from other provinces. But there's more on that later. To continue, though, there are specificities and inapplicable situations across the post-colonial global south and across former colonial masters, but the land grabbing patterns broadly hold. For those of you who don't know, the Philippines is an archipelago in Southeast Asia. We were colonized by Spain in 1521, by the USA in 1898, and we were occupied by Imperial Japan in World War II, survived a 20-year Marcos dictatorship from the 1960s to the 80s. We endured a deeply bloody war on drugs under the Duterte administration, and we are currently living through the resurgence of the Marcos kleptocracy through Marcos Jr., who is currently president. All of those events involve dispossession of one kind or another, which is to say that lots of people got erased from, or kicked out of, or lost control over their own territories because someone else stood to profit or benefit off those territories. Before we move forward, a brief review of what land grabbing is. So, land grabbing is when a person or entity wrests control or ownership of a certain territory from those who reside within the area. The land grabber is more often than not richer and or more politically powerful than the ones whose lands are being grabbed. Now, this happened a lot in the Philippines, and it continues to happen to this day. But anyway, the Philippines was never empty land. Pre-colonial Philippine history is not well documented, nor is it widely taught in grade school nor high school, but archaeological evidence, non-Western records, and even colonial documents show that the islands that would eventually become known as the Republic of the Philippines had a pre-Hispanic history that was rich, diverse, and deeply entangled with East and Southeast Asia. Which is to say that a lot of people were here, thriving and minding our own business before Spain arrived. And Spain's 300-plus year occupation here was not nearly as genocidal as its occupation of the Americas, but much of that was because, as part of many Asian trade networks already, we didn't have the same vulnerability to old world diseases as the folks in the Americas, or in what is now known as the Americas, had at that time. But still, Spain's discovery of the Philippines eventually spelled cultural change and widespread ethnocide and epistemicide for the 150 distinct ethnicities, and probably more, that inhabited the islands. Pre-colonial cultures were demonized, sacred objects were burned, and relationships to territory, ecosystem, and community were destroyed and reshaped to fit the conveniences of crown and cross. And while the Philippines wasn't empty, its lands were not necessarily settled. Most communities that would later make up the majority of lowland Filipinos, such as myself, participated in swidden agriculture, traveling from place to place with the seasons. And some still do, but today this form of agriculture has been demonized as unlawful and ecologically harmful. So the locals' nomadic ways made it difficult to extract corvée or forced labor and tribute. So Spanish authorities enforced reducción and the encomienda system, which meant that folks were forcibly settled, and the community territories were hamleted into townships with plazas, cathedrals, and peoples, regardless of tribal or clan affiliation, were brought bajo de campana, or under the bell. This meant that they were forced to live within earshot of cathedral bells, and thus within easy reach of church and administrative authorities. It also led to the application, eventually, of the Regalian Doctrine, which is the presumption that all the land in a given territory belonged to the Spanish crown, and later, post-Spanish colonization, to the state. The Regalian Doctrine continues to be enforced today, which means that under contemporary Philippine law, and please, lawyer-type folks, correct me if I'm phrasing this incorrectly, it's presumed that all land and resources thereunder belong to the Philippine government, and that it is up to those who claim ownership of an area to prove otherwise. And, proving that, it so often involves special knowledge, access to lawyers, mountains of paperwork, and no small amount of money. So that's something that a lot of indigenous folk and local traditional communities don't have access to. And just to reiterate, this royal land grab from 500 years ago continues to be enforced today. The colonial land grab of the Spanish crown still affects how land and territory are understood here. That is a profound form of epistemicide, and it is part of the air we Filipinos and a lot of other post-colonial peoples now breathe. But we're not done yet, because after the Spanish came the Americans, and their colonial regime, while also extractive, was very different. So in 1898, when the newly formed Philippine Revolutionary Government was on the verge of expelling Spanish representatives from Manila, America swooped in for the kill and purchased the Philippines from Spain in the Treaty of Paris. This is how the land under the Spanish crown became land that belonged to the state, the U.S. state. But there were places to the south of the Philippines that remained unconquered by Spain, and the peoples of the south were the Moro and Lumad peoples in Mindanao. There were also frontier areas, such as in Palawan to the west, where malaria and tropical diseases kept civilized administration to a minimum. So on a side note, just a little aside, the peoples of Mindanao proved so formidable a foe to the American forces during the Philippine-American War and the rebellions that happened afterwards, that earlier iterations of the M1911 or Colt 45 pistol were created specifically to fell juramentado warriors, who were berserker warriors, basically people who fought for their freedom so hard that they refused to go down. But, well, as we shall see, they went down. The American-style frontier governance came into play in different ways for these territories, which is to say that to facilitate the conquest of many of these intractable areas, aside from a swiftly quashed policy of reservations for unchristianized peoples, which was similar to America's policy towards the indigenous inhabitants of Turtle Island, i.e. the actual people who lived there and, belonged there, settlement was the method of choice. What happened was that homesteaders from more heavily populated provinces in Luzon and Visayas were incentivized to settle in the underpopulated areas such as Mindanao and Palawan. It was seen as a convenient way to solve agrarian unrest issues in the more populated provinces, while also bringing the Philippine frontiers to heel. It's, to them anyway, it was a win-win situation. And along the way, the Philippines had transitioned from an American possession to a Commonwealth country under significant American guidance. Now, under that guidance, the National Land Settlement and Administration was created, and internal settler colonialism continued apace as land grants to Lumad and Moro territories, indigenous territories, were handed out to more civilized or easily controlled Filipinos from Christianized provinces. They were handed out like candy. But the situation wasn't win-win at all. Today, agrarian unrest and uneasy political tensions continue to roil, and new neo-colonial forms of land grabbing are snatching up the lands of remaining indigenous peoples and local communities, both here and throughout the global south. But that's for next time. To sum up, colonial land grab patterns, as illustrated by the Philippine example, include the wholesale usurpation of entire territories through royal decree, the hamleting of force or forced displacement of communities, and the settlement of frontier territories by non-local populations. Ethnic cleansing and all-out war were also methods briefly hinted at, but not deeply explored here, because while they were certainly put to use in the Philippines, there is a far more immediate and urgent such land grab going on right now in Palestine. And this is going on while a too little too late ceasefire is in effect. So I've added a link to the Palestine Children's Fund in the description below, and I strongly urge you to speak out about it. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to support what I'm doing, you can go to ChristinaMSaison.com/support to check out ways to help an aspiring professional angry person out. And if you've gotten this far, thank you for sticking around. See you next time.